I want to say Yasher Koach to Eric. It's yeah. But everything is easier because Zachary is giving you a hug. On the high holidays. On the high holidays, we reflect on what is eternal, not what is in yesterday's newspaper. But Judaism is not just a disembodied system of ideas and values. We are a people in history, in covenant with God, in covenant with one another, as real people living at the beginning of the 21st century. We face real challenges. And one of those challenges is anti-Semitism. Defining anti-Semitism is not easy. The late philosopher Isaiah Berlin is said to have quipped, "An anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is absolutely necessary." It makes us laugh, but we need more sophistication than jokes and pithy aphorisms. In her book, Antisemitism Here and Now, U.S. Ambassador and Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism, Deborah Lipstadt, writes to two confused students, quote, "You need not be the least bit uncomfortable by or frustrated by the fact that you can't quite define antisemitism. You are hardly alone. Much of the general public can't define it. Even scholars in the field can't agree on a precise definition. If scholars can't agree, I, as your rabbi, am not here today to solve or to decide this question for you, but we need to wrestle with it individually, and we need to talk with each other civilly and with our non-Jewish neighbors. Why? Because how we define anti-Semitism will not, of course, stop people who want to hate Jews from hating Jews, but how we define and respond to anti-Semitism will deeply affect our relationships with our fellow Americans, with each other, with our kids, and ultimately with the American Jewish future. One cannot understand our people's response to anti-Semitism without the Shoah. Not 80 years later, American Jewry is still recovering from and influenced by the trauma of the Shoah in ways that we do not fully understand ourselves. We can say that in 1945, Jews responded in four ways. First, some Eastern European Jews chose to deny their Judaism. One might assume that in 1945, as the horrors of the Shoah became known, the world was racked with guilt and compassion for Jews. That is not the case. In a poll taken in 1945 after the war, when asked if the United States should admit more refugees than before, only 5% said yes. And 1/3 of those polled in the United States said that we should admit fewer after the Shoah. From 1945 to 1952, up to 250,000 Jewish survivors languished in DP camps across Eastern Europe, while the United States admitted fewer than 15,000 refugees between spring of 45 and June of 1947. Even after the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the doors of the world were shut. While Nazi war collaborators from the Baltics and the Ukraine were given preferential treatment for visas to the United States. When you travel to Eastern Europe today, You can meet young adults who found out only recently that their grandparents were Jewish, because in 1945, those grandparents opted out of Judaism and the Jewish people. They concluded that the world would never accept Jews or Judaism, and that the only way for their children and their children's children to survive was that for them to assimilate completely. For the sake of survival, they sat down and walked away from the Torah and traditions that had been passed on to them through thousands of years of Jewish history. A second way, ultra-Orthodox Jews made a different but similarly extreme choice. They too concluded that the Shoah once and for all had definitively proven that the non-Jewish world would never accept Jews, and that even if it would, why would any Jews in their right mind want to be part of such a world that could do such a thing? So they doubled down on building a strong but insular Jewish life, walled off as much as possible from the modern world. This second response is exemplified by the American Yiddish poet Yankiv Klangstein, who wrote in April 1938, "Good night, wide world, big stinking world. Not you, but I shut the gate." But Islam shut the gate. Go to hell with your dirty cultures, world, flabby democracy, with your cold compresses of sympathy, from Wagner's idle music to wordless melody to humming. I kiss you, cankered Jewish life. It weeps in me, the joy of coming home. Zionist Jews in Israel and American Jews chose different, more moderate paths in the wake of the Shoah. Much of the physical, political, and cultural infrastructure of the state of Israel had already been created, but in the wake of the Shoah, Zionists intensified their efforts to found a state of Israel. They rejected extreme notions that Jews should either abandon their identities completely or self-ghettoize by, quote, slamming shut the gate on the big stinking world. Zionism asserted that Jews can and must be part of the world. But they said, we are done begging and hoping for the world to accept us. Zionists said Jews have the same right as the French and the English and the Japanese and other peoples around the world. Jews have a right to an autonomous state in our homeland, Israel. They said, we don't trust the world to keep us safe. We will participate in the world, but only from the security and dignity of a place in the world of our own. And finally, American Jews charted a fourth path. Many of you saw Ken Burns' latest documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust, broadcast last week. It is must-see TV, especially for our teens and young adults. Despite, as the Burns documentary demonstrates, America's unwillingness either to do more to stop the Shoah in Europe or to open its doors to more significant numbers of European Jews, American Jews continued to trust in America's goodness, in the possibility that America could be a different diaspora experience than most of Jewish history. Our ancestors trusted in the viability and the stability of American democracy. We believed that here Jews could achieve prosperity, security, and respect for ourselves as Jews, but that here in America, not only that, but that here in America, we could best live out Judaism's commitment to building a world of tzedek u'mishpat, of justice and righteousness. On this Rosh Hashanah, as 5783 begins, many American Jews feel less confident about the American Jewish experiment, about the American experiment than ever before. We are confident enough for now to stay. Some people do wonder if we are not the proverbial frog in boiling water. But few Jews are packing up and moving to Israel. What is indisputable is that Israel's existence profoundly affects our lives as American Jews, not in theory, not in general. Our lives and our kids. I want to tell you two stories about children at Bethel. The first one had their B'nai Mitzvah before I arrived, but we've gotten to know each other somewhat on trips when this person returns home, sometimes for the high holidays. They're a young adult now, the child of someone still in our community. And at breakfast a few months ago, this young adult's parent looked across the table at me and, fighting back tears, said to me, "There's a website with my kid's picture on it. They called my Jewish child an anti-Semite." One of our kids has been listed on a website that, quote, documents people and groups that promote hatred of the USA, Israel, and Jews. Friends, our children are not the enemy. I don't care how much you disagree about Israel. Believe me, I probably couldn't disagree more with some of the things that this young person has written and publicly said about Israel. Some of those statements may even meet various definitions of anti-Semitism, but we may never demonize our children and fellow Jews in the name of defending the state of Israel. Rabbi Daniel Hartman, the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, spoke this summer, and he said he feels that the pro-Israel community has lost its direction. He argued that if the only moral conversation about Israel is happening among those who hate Israel, then Zionism will not only lose our children, it has lost itself. Hartman argued, for example, that Jews who love and support Israel must be able to use words like occupation and Nakba. Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe. It is how most Palestinians refer to the founding of the state of Israel, because our moment of triumph and victory and redemption was, for most of them, a catastrophe. Israel has now occupied West Bank Palestinians for more than 55 years. Does using these words, occupation and Nakba, mean that I think that Israel is illegitimate and that I'm ready to abandon Zionism? Does it mean that I think that Palestinians bear no responsibility for what happened to them in 1948 and for their lives today? No, it doesn't mean that. Palestinians have agency and responsibility for their plight in the world, but we should be mature enough in our conversations with each other to acknowledge that when Jews used power to found a modern state, as happens with the founding of virtually every modern state in the world, that when Jews used power to found a modern nation state, Palestinians suffered. And that until Israel's occupation of Palestinians in the West Bank ends, Palestinians will continue to suffer. Caring about and acknowledging Palestinian suffering does not make your rabbi anti-Israel. It doesn't make our children and our fellow Jews anti-Semites. However painful their criticism is and however much you disagree with them, we have a duty to love them, to love our fellow Jews, to be like God, patient and compassionate, and not, God forbid, to demonize or push away. Does this mean that our community can have no standards? No. Sometimes when people use public speech, it hurts other Jews. And it even stokes anti-Semitism. And when it does, we should respond lovingly, but firmly. The fact that false accusations are levied by Jews does not make them true, nor should it shield them from public refutation. When the Durham City Council passed a resolution singling out Israel in 2018, 11 community rabbis, including myself, publicly responded in proper tone and content, condemning the resolution, even though the mayor and some of the proponents of the resolution were Jewish. In addition, we initiated conversations, both with our city political and faith leaders and with our fellow Jews. We have continued to welcome those Jews into our synagogues, something that I am proud of and remain committed to. And my door will always be open to talk with a fellow Jew who is interested in honest dialogue. And Bethel is not a university, though we are surrounded by many. As we educate about Israel, it is wise and reasonable for us to have limits. We will never have educational programs that encourage Islamophobia or that dehumanize Palestinians and their national aspirations. And we will not have programs that dehumanize Israelis or delegitimize the state of Israel. We have a right and a responsibility to educate and protect the children of our community in ways that reflect our values. Which brings me to the second story about one of our kids. This one is about something that happened to one of our Bethel middle schoolers at their local public school not far from here. In class, on more than one occasion, throughout 7th grade, the social studies teacher made comments referring to Israel as a racist apartheid state, and then turned to our middle schooler in front of the rest of the class and asked them, since they are Jewish, to respond to these criticisms. There are so many problems with what happened to that child throughout the year. A teacher repeatedly bullying a student because of their identity, what would never be tolerated against other minorities is invisible when it comes to Jews. The website of the United States Department of State lists, and I quote, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel as a contemporary example of anti-Semitism in schools. The accusation of Israel as a racist and apartheid state can be refuted, as both US Ambassador Dennis Ross and former Palestinian negotiator Gaith al-Omari argued just last week at a presentation near here at the University of North Carolina. The accusation diminishes the evil of South Africa's regime, distorts the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as something that it is not. And as former South African jurist and a critic of many, many Israeli policies, Justice Richard Goldstone of the Goldstone Report once wrote, quote, "Those who conflate the situations in Israel and the West Bank and liken both to old South Africa do a disservice to all who hope for justice and peace." But the larger point is that for a teacher to expect a Jewish seventh grader to answer those challenges in front of their peers on a regular basis is ridiculous. And it happened here to one of our kids. And I promise you, they were not the only one. Figuring out the line between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism is hard. It may not feel like the stuff of high holidays. Some people would prefer that I just focus on prayer and Torah study today, but a commitment to Jewish ideas will wither if it is cut off from the roots and nourishment of the lived experience of the Jewish people. Subscribing to Jewish beliefs absent commitment to the current historical family that gave rise to them is a mistaken, frail conception of Jewish identity that cannot last. I don't talk about these things too often, but for me, not to talk about Israel and anti-Semitism on these high holidays, well, believe me, it would make my life much easier, would be an abdication of my responsibility. These things are happening to our children. We gather on the high holidays in community to sing, to repent, to reflect, to pray. And as we do, we are invited to think about how to best ground ourselves in and stand up for our Jewish identity in America today. The ability for all of us to identify and understand and responsibly respond to anti-Semitism is a very important tool for all of us and for our children. And I'm going to offer today one tool for how each one of us can evaluate for ourselves whether an argument about Israel may be crossing the line from legitimate criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism. Other tools and frameworks exist. My hope is to prime our conversation, not to end it. We can begin by saying what should be obvious, which is that criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. With that said, one tool for navigating the difference between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism is a 3D test that was conceived of by Natan Sharansky and adopted by the United States State Department in 2010. The 3Ds are demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. When people use images associated with classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis, or they draw comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, or they blame Israel entirely for all of the interreligious and political tensions in the Middle East, this is demonization, and it's anti-Semitism. When people apply a double standard to Israel by requiring of it behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, or, for example, when the United Nations Human Rights Council calls out Israel for fully half of their human rights condemnations, more than the resolutions against Syria, Iran, and North Korea combined, that's anti-Semitism. And when people deny the Jewish people their right, our right to self-determination, when they characterize the return of the Jewish people to our homeland after 3,000 years as a racist, white colonialist endeavor, and those terms in our society are calling into question the very legitimacy of Israel to exist, that is delegitimization, and it's anti-Semitism. My friend and Hartman colleague, Rabbi Angela Buchdahl of Central Synagogue in New York, spoke about anti-Semitism a few years ago. She said, opposition to Israel has increasingly become a necessary precondition for all other progressive commitments. Some groups will only allow Jews to participate if they take a disloyalty oath and affirm that they are opposed to Israeli racism. This singling out Israel as the litmus test for Jewish involvement in any social justice cause is anti-Semitism, plain and simple, and I beg of you students in college to call it out when you see it. That's Rabbi Buchdahl. I agree completely. She also pointed out how standing up for ourselves in these moments is very complicated. She says, quote, we can't win. If we don't complain, nothing happens. And if we make a fuss, we're accused of abusing our disproportionate power and influence, which is exactly how Jews have been slandered for centuries. Unfortunately, she writes, I fear that we've begun to internalize this prejudice. And it on a practical note, that they will be participating in the Kulanu Synagogues in Action Against Anti-Semitism program offered by the Anti-Defamation League. Kulanu means, in Hebrew, all of us. It is an 8-month program offering selected synagogues exclusive access to expert insight and webinars, and an opportunity to be part of a community of practice and work to build meaningful connections between synagogues and addressing anti-Semitism. And if you're interested in leading or participating in our cohort, please contact Dan Schnitzer. Dan, where are you? There he is. Okay, he's our president. Okay, contact Dan. He will be very happy to have you aboard. And if you are confused, if your children have experienced anti-Semitism, you're confused about something that happened, please reach out to me. I won't have all the answers, but I want to be of support. We also, by the way, must be swivel-headed in addressing anti-Semitism, both on the right and on the left. And journalist Yair Rosenberg advises, fight anti-Semitism where you are. Not just when it's politically expedient because it's being done by the person on the other side of the aisle with whom you already disagree. If you fight it where you are, it's more credible and more effective. We must resist the desire to leave the table when we feel we are not wanted. Rabbi Buchdahl said to fight anti-Semitism, we also must resist our understandable desire to leave when we feel like we are not wanted. It's not easy to sit at a table and engage when we feel under attack, but we have to stay in it, stay in the conversation about Israel, stay in the fight for pluralistic causes, because we have always been at the forefront against oppression of all kinds. And when others don't invite us to the table, perhaps we have to be willing to invite them to ours. Most of all, this is not something that can be answered or addressed with one initiative or one sermon. I encourage you to read. for yourselves. One excellent book I've already mentioned by Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt is Anti-Semitism Here and Now. There are many others that I and others can recommend. The topic is something for all of us to think about and talk about together as a diverse community who think about the world and Jewish experience differently, but who love. I trust you. I trust we love each other, and we can do this. One more thing, we should remember that the word anti-Semitism is a blunt instrument, and using it carelessly can diminish its meaning. It coarsens public discourse. It can, and it can damage our relationship with our non-Jewish neighbors. If scholars and Jews of all kinds can't agree on a definition and find it hard to navigate the line between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, imagine how non-Jews must feel. Sometimes good, well-meaning people make an honest mistake, not understanding that they are using a term that perpetuates anti-Semitic stereotypes. Let's err on the side of calm and curiosity. Before I conclude, I want to say that I wish that I wasn't so nervous about giving this sermon. Some people say, don't talk about Israel. You'll hurt people, you'll alienate them from the congregation, or worse, from Judaism itself. I hope you know that is never my aim. Part of what I pray for on the high holidays and every day is that God gives me the wisdom to speak in such a way that brings people closer, not farther away. And part of the pain and fear that I carry in my heart is that I fall short. Whenever someone shares a moment, a story with me about their rabbi from childhood who said something that drove them away from Judaism, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, I really hope that's not me. And if I upset you or angered you today or sometime during the year, please, please, I ask your forgiveness and ask you to reach out so we can talk about whatever is on your mind. What is the way forward? The journey from 1945 to today is perhaps for the Jewish people something, nothing short of miraculous. We are so blessed, every one of us, to be alive in an extraordinary moment in Jewish history. The Jewish people have a homeland for the first time in 2,000 years, and this American Jewish community is stronger and more powerful, and with all our worries, more accepted and loved than perhaps any Jewish community in history. We need to lead with, not with fear, but with faith, not with suspicion, but with trust, not with hate, but with love. We are so lucky to be alive right now. Is there anti-Semitism? Yes. And when it appears, most often we help ourselves best when we initiate brave conversations with curiosity, with pride at being Jewish, standing firmly and gently in our identity. Long term, we must double down on the grand American experiment in which our ancestors trusted so many years ago. We must vote and do everything we can to support and strengthen the American democratic system that keeps us safe and which our ancestors bequeathed to us. And we must continue to build loving relationships with our neighbors. We have an imam, Abdullah Antepli, who calls this his synagogue. We have strong relationships with the Diwan Center and Imam Abdul Wahid, the Muslim chaplain at Duke, and our friends at Al-Razak Islamic Center. We are blessed for the love and friendship of Reverend Katie Crow and our friends at Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church, with whom we were so lucky to travel to Israel this summer. We are blessed by the presence of Bishop Ronald Godby and our friends at the River Church, with whom, God willing, we will travel to Washington next spring to visit the U.S. Holocaust Memorial and the African American History Museum. These faithful friendships give me hope for everything that is good and what's possible in American. They are a beacon of hope. As Jews and Americans, not only do we benefit from these relationships, but we have a sacred obligation to fight against racism, to continue the fight for a more just and equal country, to stand in solidarity with our friends, not merely so they will stand with us in dark times, but because doing so makes our lives better. It makes the world better. Hine matov uma na'im. Behold, what is good and what is pleasant when brothers and sisters dwell together. To know another human being in their fullness and difference is to experience a taste of paradise, and to be fully known and loved for who we are as Jews in the world, with respect for our heritage and for the precious place that Israel plays in the story of the Jewish people. That is something that our ancestors could only have dreamed of. And they couldn't even dream it in 1945. But it's ours. And it is a vision for what the future of American Jewish life can hold. Shana Tova.